it is supremely hypocritical for U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry to issue threats towards Russia and towards Foreign Minister Lavrov in regards to any Russian military assistance and advisory in Syria, because, well, actually, there's two distinctly different reasons as to why this is hypocritical. First and foremost, it is a complete disregard for international norms, because Russia is fully entitled to participate in an advisory role in Syria, as it is an ally of President Assad and the Syrian government, and because the Syrian government has, of course, formally requested their assistance. But I think at the larger level, this is utterly hypocritical, because the U.S. position is describing Russia's assistance to Syria as perhaps escalating the conflict and destabilizing the situation in Syria, when, of course, we know that the United States and its allies have actually created the war in Syria and have been destabilizing it since 2011 by arming terrorist proxies, by providing the financing, as well as the political cover in the form of the propaganda about so-called Free Syrian Army and so-called rebels, when I think it is internationally recognized now that these are actually terrorist groups that have been backed by the U.S., its Western allies, as well as its regional allies in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Israel, and beyond. And so to say that Russia's involvement is destabilizing is utterly disingenuous and deeply cynical, because, of course, the real reason why the U.S. is concerned about Russia's involvement, whether it is increased in Syria or not, is actually twofold. First and foremost, the U.S. is concerned that its regime change agenda in Syria, which has failed to this point, will be a complete and utter failure with increased Russian assistance, because, of course, the attempt to undermine, destabilize, and ultimately overthrow the government of Syria cannot take place if Syria's ally in Russia maintains its steadfast position and begins to increase both military shipments as well as advisors and possibly special forces on the ground if that were to happen, though we have not seen any conclusive evidence that it has happened. So if that were to happen, however, the U.S. understands that regime change is essentially off the table, and they will be forced into a political dialogue, which is what the Russians have been calling for since 2011, which is ultimately what people who are interested in peace have been calling for since the very beginning of this conflict. So in that sense, the U.S. is definitely concerned about any Russian involvement, and I think even at the larger international level, the U.S. is desperately afraid that Russia has essentially called its bluff in terms of fighting a war against the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever it needs to be called, because when the United States employs the rhetoric that it wants to devastate and destroy the terror network that we call ISIS, it is in fact a complete lie, or at the very least a distortion of what the U.S. really wants to do. It doesn't want to destroy ISIS. It wants to manage ISIS. It wants to manage ISIS's development. It wants to direct it in certain areas. It wants to use it to implement regime change, to destabilize, to fracture, and otherwise destroy the Syrian state as well as the Iraqi state. It wants to use terrorism in the form of ISIS just as it's used terrorism for decades, that is to say, to execute its political and geopolitical agenda. So when they say they want to destroy ISIS, they are lying. But when Russia says that it wants to destroy ISIS, I think everybody recognizes that they're definitely serious about it, because Russia has taken the threat of international terrorism quite seriously. It's been victimized by international terrorism repeatedly since at least the 1990s in Chechnya, the Caucasus region. The Russians understand quite clearly the very dangerous threat that terrorism emanating from Syria poses to their position as those Chechen terrorists and others from Dagestan and Ingushetia and all those regions come back out of Syria, back towards their homes, and turn their guns and their bombs against Russia. So Russia is serious about destroying the Islamic State, and that is what the U.S. fears. So when Russia gets deeply involved in Syria, the U.S. knows regime change is off the table and terrorism is off the table. And that means the only thing left is politics and diplomacy, and the U.S. is desperately fearful of that.